Hello, beautiful community. Let's talk about Putin's 3.25 hour conversation with particular representatives of foreign media. It shows signs of tentativeness and weakness, but not panic. And I want to discuss that with you. And the themes I'm going to bring out are his comments on the targeting of a sliver of Russian territory by Western weapons, on stopping the war, on the West removing Zelensky, which is what Putin thinks will happen within a year, and on Biden versus Trump. Now, I'm very grateful for your patience with me with slightly slower service on the chat channel and on the main channel. It's because I'm going through some medical stories. But there's a good chance on Sunday, Monday, there'll be a big propaganda video on the main channel. I'll keep you updated about that. And I'm grateful for your patience with slightly less frequent chats, and I hope we'll be back to regular service by mid-June. Now, because I work 2 or 3 hours a day, a 3.25 hour Putin speech is something like a 16-hour Putin speech for a healthy person. And so I'm very grateful. For your encouragement in the face of my sacrifice. I'm being silly. Let's talk about it. Big picture. We always talk about this crossroads for Putin between politicization and depoliticization. He needs Russian citizens on the couch, positively avoiding politics, and he needs them at the front, and he needs them to begin floating around in Putinite ideology. And maybe the video after next on the main channel will actually be about Putin's ideology, about which the quality of our discussion is not good enough, I believe. Now, that's always a background tension. You and I have been talking about it for a long time. But there are moments, and he faced such a moment at the end of 2022, when this general tension that's absolutely key for the evolution of the Putin regime over the next half a decade becomes a matter of immediate practical politics. And now he is in a period, he feels, where that crossroads is a matter of immediate practical politics. And Putin is facing a choice between a pause and politicization, much deeper politicization of society, militarization of society. The problem with the pause is that he can't quite visualize it as he would like. It's not immediately clear to him what that looks like. He's spending a lot of time ventilating about that possibility, trying to lure the West into that possibility. But even he himself can't clearly envision what he wants in terms of a pause, and it has to be a pause that weakens rather than strengthens Ukraine. He can't easily envision that happening, but he's working toward that possibility being on the table for him. So it's a kind of uncertain, not entirely available pause on the one hand. On the other hand, there is politicization or fascization of society, because Putin's regime has many fascist features, but the population doesn't have that many fascist features at this point. So it's a paradox. It's a fascistized regime without a fascistized population. But this is a moving picture, right? And we need to see where it lands. But this business of politicizing the population is a challenge for Putin because he is ready to do it. he thinks it's kind of inevitable, but he isn't sure about how and when. And he is also experienced enough to, with full maturity of political judgment, understand that that's a transition he can't entirely control. So it's like a step into the unknown for him. And it could be calamitous very rapidly. And he knows that. So these are the two options, and they're always in the background for him. But now he is positively trying to explore this business of a pause in the war. And so he is having to engage with this question in terms of immediate practical politics. And that is a position of precarity and weakness. It's not a position of existential vulnerability of the kind that the Putin regime indeed experienced in the first perhaps year and a half of the war through to the Prigozhin mutiny. So that's the big picture. Let's take a look at it a little bit in more detail. A few remarks on targeting Russia. Here is Putin in my rapid translation. Why don't we have a right, in response to the West giving this limited permission for Ukraine to use Western weapons on that sliver of Russian territory? Why don't we have a right to supply a similar class of weaponry to those regions of the world which will deliver strikes on sensitive targets belonging to those countries which do this in respect of Russia? Our response may be asymmetrical. Now, it's not quite clear what he means by asymmetrical here, because if he is talking about providing weapons to countries or agents who will target the West, that sounds reasonably symmetrical. Perhaps he's talking about targeting non-Western territory, Western objects or non-Western territory. Now, of course, and he says we will reflect on this, and the West giving this permission to Ukraine is direct participation in the war against Russia. And there's going to be a theme here, which is the radical Z theme. And the radical Z question about this is, well, if that's direct war against Russia, where's your response, Mr. Weak President? Now, of course, these are just words, because Russia already gives stuff to various agents around the world who are in conflict with the West. Does this mean he's going to give different stuff and more stuff? How far is it possible given Russia's own needs? So the only political analysis I'd put on this is that words like this are themselves a political act and have a momentum of their own, although I don't have anything to say about what kind of momentum that might be. But the context into which I would put them is the global trend toward the interpenetration of conflicts and toward what we discussed in that video on the breakdown of the global order, which is I still rate as the best video on the main channel, but the music there is a little too high, unfortunately. But there we talked about developing a world of as developing into a world of enemies in certain respects, right? Where X is an enemy of yours, but there are some dimensions on which you're not. And this is sort of part of a wider net of global conflict and increasingly interconnected global conflict and compromise. We lost ourselves because my smartphone ran out of battery. Last remark about targeting Russia. Could the Putin regime have avoided the West giving this permission to Ukraine, given how reluctant the West was to give this permission? That's a question, if not for Putin himself, then for anybody in his regime who supports his project, but might be critical of the efficacy with which he prosecutes it. Moving on to stopping the war now. This is a Putin quote. If you want to bring about the cessation of military activities in Ukraine, stop supplying the weapons, and the military activities will end within 2 and maximum 3 months. That is it. End of quote. And the wonderful Russian commentator Vladimir Pastukhov brought particular attention yesterday to this passage in Putin's Q&A session by pointing out quite rightly how weak this seems to a Prigozhinite perspective, or the perspective of anybody who is critical not of the war but of the efficacy and the hard-lineness of its prosecution. It's like me saying, well, I started this fight with my neighbor, but the neighbor only had his arms tied up, his legs were perfectly free to hit me. Now, of course, if his legs were not free, the fight would be over within 2 to 3 hours, 3 hours maximum. But it's just a matter of somebody tying his legs. As soon as his legs are tied up, it's a fight I'm going to win. So, you're declaring a war on the West. You're talking about Ukraine not even existing in any meaningful sense, not existing normatively, not existing in terms of political agency. You're at war with the West, or at least you are yourself a representative of a declining thread of Western civilization that needs to be resuscitated by you defeating the West as it is, to convert the West into becoming once again the West as it was or as it should be. But if that's what you're saying, and then the West gives military assistance to Ukraine without getting directly involved in the conflict, and you cry, but you declared the war in the first place, and your opponent is fighting with one arm, and you cry. So this is pause rhetoric. This is not politicization rhetoric. Paused rhetoric frustrates the hawkish voices that want a harder and more efficacious fight. Then Putin goes on. We call for non-interference with a possible peace process. This is again this sort of exploration of the pause. This is difficult for Putin because, not as difficult as it is for Ukraine, but it's really difficult because there isn't a picture that's emerging that satisfies even two of the three sides, if you like, the West, Ukraine, and Russia. What Putin wants isn't satisfactory for the West and is completely inadmissible for Ukraine. He wants a pause that progressively weakens Ukraine as a means of continuing the war, basically. Now, what Ukraine wants and what the West wants, insofar as we can generalize about that, also misaligns. And that's because the West is hoping to freeze the conflict, but not finding a way to do so. But quite certainly freezing the conflict means non-NATO reasonable-ish security guarantees for Ukraine, and Ukraine losing a lot of territory. That is unavailable to Zelensky for several reasons, one of which being that the conversation inside Ukraine hasn't gone yet sufficiently, to put it mildly, through a reevaluation of the original narrative of the war, which is a victorious war with territorial reacquisition, including Crimea. What else is an adequate outcome for Ukraine that's not this is a question that has not had civic purchase in Ukraine yet, right? So a compromise that would work for the West, in the sense that the West would accept it, not that it would be positive or sustainable, it is a compromise that Ukraine could be potentially forced into, but Zelensky would lose power if that happened. So Zelensky couldn't do it. So none of the parties align. And when we talk about security guarantees for Ukraine, Putin wants security guarantees. And security guarantees for Putin mean significant demilitarization of Ukraine. It means putting Ukraine in a position to be engaged on a much weaker footing in the future in the continuation of the same war, right? So Putin is interested in a pause, not as something constructive from the point of view of global order. He's interested in a pause that gets him closer to full political control over Ukraine. Doesn't necessarily mean full territorial acquisition, but full political control over Ukraine. So that's the challenge we're facing. And Western leaders, on the one hand, recognize that. On the other hand, are looking for some way of freezing the conflict without clearly seeing one. So that's where we're swimming at the moment. And Putin is naive about this in many respects. He's naive about Ukraine's agency. He doesn't understand that a real proxy war is a proxy war where the proxy has agency, very painful agency, right? Ukraine's battle for independence and political survival is dependent on US domestic politics and to a lesser degree on European politics. It'll be more dependent on European politics as time passes. But Putin doesn't understand that the way a correct description of this war, if you want to describe it as a proxy war, would have to be a description that gives Ukraine very considerable agency. You can't even begin to understand this war just in causal terms unless you give Ukraine agency, and Putin doesn't. He goes on to say, this is the next section, the West will get rid of Zelensky in a year. Quote, this will take a year, then they will get rid and replace him. Well, there is a part of the mind of Joe Biden where he wishes he could flick a finger and decide what happens in Ukraine, but he can't. And this is Putin engaging in some scenario building / magical thinking about getting a pause that works for him, even though that is completely, egregiously unacceptable to Ukraine and unacceptable, perhaps less egregiously so, but still unacceptable to the West. And this is something that we consistently, that the people who want to advocate for Ukraine, I mean, there is a whole video on the main channel about how some voices in the West, for instance, the left, are mistaken in their advocacy for, a negotiated settlement. But one of the things we don't understand when we ask for a negotiated settlement instead of further support for Ukraine is that Putin has his own security needs as he perceives them, and they are needs that largely require the slow destruction of Ukraine. There's an obstance there, a real obstance. We need that faithful political and historical understanding. Now, I am in this awkward position where I don't love making too strong a policy recommendation, but my policy recommendation remains maximal military support for Ukraine above what's being given, even if it is not accompanied by an evolution of strategy. But an evolution of strategy is something we need more of, even though realistically speaking, our democracies are too wobbly and fraught to properly develop a strategy. So given everything we've said in the last 10 minutes, I wanted to re-emphasize this. You know that's my position, but I re-emphasize it in case you happen to be new here. People calling for peace are not seriously reckoning with Putin's requirements and with why he wants a cessation of the war. Right? It's a mechanism for winning the war for Putin. Then there was a section about Russia's highly imperfect economic isolation where Putin just talked up how well the Russian economy is doing. And he roughly said that the West's politics about the isolation of Russia is incoherent, and that Western citizens know that Western politics to isolate Russia is just bullshit, because here they go taking all kinds of goodies from Russia, and then there they go trying to isolate Russia. There are two hands doing opposite things. It's a political embarrassment. The people see through it, and because they see through it, Western democracies are declining because their own citizens can't take them seriously. So that's the point he was pressing, that then gets further exaggerated in his remarks on Trump and Biden. And I'm going to quote him extensively here. Everyone laughed at me when I said I prefer Biden over Trump, but Biden attacked me after I said what I said, and I predicted that he would attack me. That is to say, he's an old-school politician whose actions are predictable to me. He's an old-school politician whose actions are predictable to me. I say sincerely that we don't expect anything to change after the election. Nothing serious will happen. Here's the key quote. But we all understand what is happening inside the United States. They are incinerating themselves, incinerating their own state, their political system, and I must say their own imaginary leadership in the sphere of democracy. They're burning it down all the way to the root. Everywhere in the world it is apparent that the pursuit of Trump, especially by judicial means, according to accusations or charges which were formed on the basis of events that took place a long time ago, without direct evidence, that all of that is simply the exploitation of the legal system as a tool of political conflict. In America, they know this too. People in America do not trust a legal system that makes decisions like this. We'll be touching on this more in the Russian propaganda video on the main channel. But you are hearing here, very roughly, Putin's theory of victory, which is our decline. Your and my decline is his theory of victory. And we've talked extensively already about his sort of Fukuyamianism in reverse, where he takes our decline to be much less contingent than it is, takes our democracies to be much less robust than they are, and sees them as sort of shams that are bound to unravel within a decade, so to speak. And then with a bunch of Orbans in power in the West, he can achieve the kind of pause he wants in Ukraine with this business of the fascization and politicization of society becoming possibly more optional. The trend is there anyway, but possibly more optional if things work out so well and so rapidly in his favor. What the most realistic scenario is for Putin, he thinks, is a combination of politicization and militarization of Russia, combined with increasing Western weakness. And so an increasingly politicized population, together with this fascistized regime, will be the agent that is able, without a full-scale war between Russia and the West, without full-scale nuclear war, to tip the West over into something like the dissolution of NATO and, the transformation of its security stance into something that is favorable to Russia and place Putin sees in the world for Russia. So it's this combination of politicization and militarization and Western decline that realistically the two need to work together. He'd be so lucky, he feels, if Western decline took care of his project success on its own. It's probably not going to happen. You need a bit of both. So that's the picture. And that is really what he's saying when he's talking about the internal democratic collapse in the West. He is, of course, trying to bring it about by talking about it, but more than that, he thinks he's largely just describing a pattern that will take care of itself to a good extent, whatever he says or does about it. In of itself, that pattern might not be enough to give him everything he needs. It might require, a push from a sort of messianic and aggressive Russian imperialism, but the two should take care of the situation. That's all I've got. Thank you so much for being with me. Lots of love and talk soon.